As a biologist, you believe humans didn't evolve. Why?
DNA gives us a two-part argument. One, it shows us that life can't get started, but even if life could get started, it shows us that life could not be maintained in an evolutionary scenario.
What's the big truth that DNA tells us about our origins?
DNA is screaming at us that humans and other species have not been on this planet for billions of years, because mutations would have built up to the point where we'd all be dead. Natural selection can't remove most mutations. Our genomes are falling apart. Therefore, we're not old. In your eyeball, every single photon that you detect destroys the pigment molecule. It has to be exported from the cell, fixed, and re-imported.
Wait,
For every single photon that you see, millions upon millions of them per second.
I'm legitimately shocked right now. I didn't know this. Some evolutionary biologists have claimed that the idea of human evolution has dealt a death blow to Christianity as a whole. The argument being that, well, now we know that humans evolved, we know there was no historical Adam, that means there's no original sin, and there's no need for a savior in the form of Jesus Christ. So that's where all this goes. But Dr. Carter, you say DNA provides evidence that humans did not, and in fact could not have evolved. And I know you're a geneticist who spent years researching this issue, digging into it both from a genetic and a biblical perspective. So what is it about DNA that shows we couldn't evolve?
Actually, DNA gives us a two-part argument. One, it shows us that life can't get started, but even if life could get started, it shows us that life could not be maintained in an evolutionary scenario.
Okay.
So it's a two-edged sword that cuts both ways. They can't get it going and can't keep it going.
Okay, so we'll start with the first one then.
Okay.
When you say DNA couldn't get started, what exactly do you mean by that?
Well, there's probably a half a dozen different ways to argue this. And the simplest one is you can't get DNA from a chemical soup. Phosphates is the backbone of DNA. Phosphates are really rare in the natural world. They stick to metals and become insoluble salts. So where does a phosphate come for the DNA itself? But after that, even if you could get DNA, or at least the letters of DNA, you have to string them together. But the chemistry breaks the bonds faster than they can form. So you can't make DNA in a primordial soup. But even if you could, where does the information come in the DNA? If you just string random letters together, you have random letters, and random letters don't spell out genes. There's no instruction sets in a bunch of randomly collected letters. So we can't get started. There's no way to get the origin of life from zero to living things in that sort of situation. So as far as the origin of life is concerned, DNA is the worst thing that life could ever have chosen because it makes it impossible for life to have evolved from nothing.
Yeah, and when we talk about the primordial soup, we're talking about how maybe a billion years ago, maybe longer, nobody knows how long.
It would be 4 billion years ago-ish in their model.
Okay, so 4 billion years ago or so, there's a whole bunch of different chemicals in the oceans of the early Earth, and at one day, things just happen to come together just right to create a chemical reaction to start life. But you just shown that doesn't work.
It doesn't work. All the chemistry tells us DNA breaks apart.
And I want to get out ahead of an objection that's probably going to come up in the comments. You said DNA is an information storage system.
Absolutely.
And a lot of people say, well, that's a useful analogy, but that's not actually what DNA is. What's your response to that?
DNA is absolutely an information storage system. The molecule itself is just a molecule, but it's the way the letters are arranged on that molecule that bears a message. It says, do this at this time. Copy DNA, repair DNA, make a protein, make that protein that's designed to do this or that. All that's coded into DNA. We talk about the DNA code. The code is not the letters, it's the organization of the letters. And without that code, without the information packed into DNA, life is impossible. Life requires information. Life is, in one definition, life could be said to be an information processing system. It takes in information from the environment, it makes decisions based on that information, and then it does things in response. That's information. That is language. That is something that is never going to arise from randomness. In fact, randomness destroys languages. Imagine if you had a textbook and you're trying to pass your biology class, but that textbook was hand copied by the last student.
There's going to be typos.
Yeah, and then you take your textbook and copy it by the end of the year and hand your copy to the next student. There's going to be more typos. Eventually, no one can pass the class
Because the book is
because
illegible.
the book will be full of riddled with errors. So if you don't have good, solid information in the beginning, you can't get life. And there's no way to get information that's workable, usable from random changes. Random changes destroy information.
Okay, well, you just used the image of copying a textbook, and you also made reference to DNA copying as presenting a problem from the
Yes.
evolutionary perspective. Tell me about that.
In order to have life, you don't just need DNA. So we already showed DNA is not going to come from some primordial soup.
Yeah.
You also, the information is not going to come from primordial soup, but you need ways to maintain that information. You don't get life until you can copy the DNA and pass it to the next cell. Well, that copying system, although even the simplest organisms we know of, the copying system is really complicated. I mean, dozens of proteins are used. Because DNA, as you know, is a double helix. Well, if you want to make a copy of that, you have to open up the double helix. But if you pull those two strands apart, it makes knots. You get supercoiling here, and it gets all kinked up. So you need proteins that nick the DNA and unspin it.
Wow.
Oh, where does that protein come from? Well, it's another piece of information that has to be coded into DNA. And then if you want to copy DNA, you need a very complex machine called a polymerase, which grabs onto DNA and slides along the DNA and makes a copy of one strand. What about the other strand? Well, a different DNA polymerase grabs on that strand and slides in the other direction a little bit. And then later on, it grabs on and slides a little bit. And later on, it grabs on and slides a little bit and makes these pieces. They're called Okazaki fragments. But then those pieces have to be joined together with another enzyme called DNA ligase. And you also have to remove the RNA primer, so you had to put the RNA primer there. And there's like dozens and dozens of proteins required in this step.
Okay,
Just to copy the DNA before you can have life. Yeah, I'm interrupting you on purpose to show how hard this is.
Well, yeah, and I want to make sure that we're tracking here with what you're saying. So you've got DNA. Let's just assume we have DNA. Never mind that it can't form in a primordial soup. But we've got DNA. Then, in order for life to continue, even within the same organism, you've got to copy and replicate that DNA.
Yes.
Then you need machines to
Yes.
copy that DNA.
Yes.
But things get awkward now because the code for constructing the machines that copy the DNA are in the DNA.
Absolutely. This is a massive chicken and egg problem. A massive chicken and egg problem. Because in order to have this DNA working, you need these things in the DNA itself that then make the DNA. So which came first? Well, the DNA has to come first, but you still need the code. But it's not just any old code. It's very specific things that are required to make the DNA. But it's even worse than that. All of these steps require a massive amount of energy. But the energy is made by a machine in the cell called an ATP synthase, which is made of proteins.
Which come from DNA.
Which are coded in the DNA. So you have to have the proteins in the DNA to make the proteins that make the machine that makes the energy. Which came first? You have a three-way chicken and egg problem now. And all these things are absolutely necessary from day one.
Yeah.
Or life doesn't happen. Life is impossible. You don't have life until you have energy processing, DNA processing, DNA copying, and DNA maintenance.
Okay, and we'll talk about DNA maintenance in a minute. But I just want to emphasize here that as complicated as what you just said was,
Yep.
and as hard as it was to kind of follow, wait a minute, this thing connects to this thing to this thing, that's only three components. And this is the model that you're giving to help us understand this is dramatically simplified.
Way oversimplified. Yeah, I mentioned Okazaki fragments and DNA polymerase. That's just that much. There's so much more. In fact, this is why students of biology sometimes give up. Because the amount of detail involved. But the amount of detail only shows us our God is amazing.
Yeah.
Absolutely genius that he put all the stuff in there for life to happen, for life to exist, for life to be. Forget about life evolving. It requires an incredibly intelligent creator to create life. That's what life is telling us.
Wow. You mentioned also that throughout that process of DNA copying and transcription, am I using that word right?
Yeah.
Throughout that, sometimes things go wrong, though, and it doesn't happen the way it's supposed to.
Yes.
How does that get fixed?
And DNA is a very fragile, unstable molecule. There are probably a million, what they call them, lesions, either chemical reactions or breakages of DNA in every single one of your cells every day. 1 million per cell.
Wow.
So we're
Wait, per cell,
per cell.
not total.
Yeah, times 50 trillion. That's the number of mutations that happen in your body every single day.
Okay.
And almost all of them are fixed. Almost. Occasionally one gets out of hand and you might get cancer. But almost all of them are fixed. That requires an unbelievable set of DNA repair systems. Just last year, someone was studying, a group of people studying this, they realized there's about 300 different genes involved in DNA repair. So if any one of those genes doesn't exist, you could not exist. So in higher organisms, bacteria are a little simpler, but higher organisms, about 300 genes, and there's about 50 or 60 different repair systems. Because there's all sorts of things that can happen to DNA. DNA can react with water, it can react with oxygen, one strand can break, 2 strands can break. Every single thing requires a different DNA repair pathway, different solution to a different problem. And all those things have to be coded into DNA or DNA cannot exist.
And just for reference here, this would be a lot like if you had, say, an airplane and a bunch of aircraft mechanics, and say the airplane breaks, as they're prone to do sometimes.
Yes.
Imagine then, I want you tell me if this analogy is appropriate, but what I'm imagining is that prior to the airplane breaking, you have to list out literally every single way it can possibly break or fail on every single piece, and if you don't do that, then it doesn't get fixed and the airplane potentially goes down.
And it has to be fixed while the airplane is flying. Meaning all your repair crew and all your tools need to be on board. Oh, and your repair crew also has to be having babies, and your airplane has to be able to split in half and make a perfectly functional airplane while it's flying. That's what it's like.
Okay.
It's crazy complicated.
Okay, that's a pretty crazy image. Explain to me why the repair crew needs to be having babies.
Because if the airplane is going to multiply, split in half, and become 2 airplanes, you need repair crews on both airplanes. You have to duplicate all the necessary components of the plane in order for the plane to work. So you have to multiply inside the cell all the parts of that the cell needs, if the cell's an airplane. So in other words, before the cell splits, you need DNA repair systems in both things. You need DNA in both things. You need the energy systems in both sides. You have to make it'd be like, okay, in an airplane, how about a city? You take a city and divide it in half and multiply it. Well, you need the garbage collectors, you need the mayor, you need town hall, you need the police, you need roads, you need sewers. You have to duplicate everything before your city can divide. That's the level of complexity we're talking about.
And that's what you're talking about happens in, it sounds like you're talking about meiosis. Is that right?
Mitosis.
Mitosis, okay.
Yeah, just a cell just dividing. If you don't have mitosis, you can't have life. You have to be able to propagate. That's the definition of life. You have to be able to propagate. You have to be able to multiply. You have to be able to divide. And if you can't do that, you don't have a living thing. And it's all controlled by DNA. So the process of cell division and multiplication is all coded in the DNA, which means all those systems have to be coded in the DNA. And when the cell decides to divide itself, it has to make a copy of everything, but the code is there in the DNA molecule.
And even when that process is happening of mitosis, this presents more opportunities for things to break, right?
Oh, man, yes. Even consider the cell. The cell is a little pressurized vessel. And if you want to divide it, the cell can explode very easily. And so you have to very carefully control. In fact, usually the cell, most times, they make a dividing wall in the cell first before the splitting happens, or else the cell would pop.
I remember that from high school biology, yeah, seeing the time-lapse images of it.
Yes. So cell division is complicated. Energy metabolism is complicated. The DNA molecule is complicated. And all that information is in there in the DNA, or life can't exist. So what came first? The DNA or the information? Mr. Evolutionist, they can't answer that. So that's the challenge of DNA. From the beginning, you can't get it started.
Okay, well, before we get too far away from the DNA repair systems, tell me about those, the different reactions that have to happen.
Oh, man. How much time you got? I mean, we can talk about this for a long time, but let me just use a couple examples.
Sure.
DNA is composed of letters, A, C, G, and T. Those letters are chemically reactive. The most common mutation or DNA change in the cell is a cytosine, the C, has a little thing sticking off. It's an amine, like ammonia. Ammonia is NH3. So there's a nitrogen and there's 3 hydrogens. Well, if you take that and stick it onto a carbon, now you have an amine. It's an NH2 group and it's sticking on the carbon. Well, that amine can be ripped off and happens all the time in your cells. Just DNA is chemically reactive. But when you take away the amine, that C is now chemically equivalent to a uracil.
Which is in
RNA. Yes,
thank
uracil
you.
is not in DNA. So the cell's like, what's that? This is supposed to be DNA. What's this uracil doing there? So it has to be fixed. And usually it's fixed correctly. Sometimes the cell converts that into a thymine. And now you have a C to T mutation. It happens a lot. Because cytosine is so chemically reactive, you need that DNA repair system before you can even have DNA, or DNA becomes RNA.
Just almost
Because
as
chemistry.
a law of nature.
Because of chemistry.
Second law of thermodynamics means that without these systems, it's gonna turn into RNA, and you don't have DNA.
Well, actually, the RNA is going to break apart into little letters even before that because it's such a reactive molecule.
Okay, yeah.
But let's just say that you can maintain that long molecule. Well, the C's are going to be mutating constantly. And the A's mutate. There's all sorts of chemical reactions happen, but you need that specific DNA repair system, which is complicated and you use multiple proteins to do it, or you can't have DNA. But DNA can also have a single strand break.
Okay, it looks like that's where, it's the double helix. And
Yeah,
then
you have the
one of
double helix, but they can snap because DNA is long, it's being pulled in the cell, it's being, twisted up, and you have it opening up, and you have the things that are unwinding the loops, and it can break. Well, you need a different DNA repair system to come in, grab those floating strands, and link them together again. DNA can also snap in half. Both strands can break. Now you have a double strand break, and that requires a completely different, not even related to the others, DNA repair system. In fact, what our cells do is when we have a double strand break, it uses the other chromosome, and it takes these 2 floating strands and lines them up with the other copy, and then it uses that copy to fix this copy. So whatever letters are there, it'll fill in the gap with whatever letters there and copy those letters to this one, and now we have a repair. Or we can't exist. And that's just 3 of 50 or 60 different repair systems.
Yeah.
So where does this come from? So what we said initially, there's 2 different problems here. One is you can't get evolution off the ground. And we just went through a whole lot of examples of why evolution can't get off the ground. This is why DNA shows that evolution is impossible.
And this is also why the origin of life problem in recent years gets split off from evolution as a whole.
One reason why the evolutionists are trying to distance themselves from the origin of life question is because they can't answer it, even though they have to answer it. They need a naturalistic explanation of where we came from or what caused life. God? Oh, no, they can't let that happen.
Yeah.
So they're stuck in a hard place here. They're trying to distance themselves from the problems, and yet they need to solve that problem, or else they don't have an explanation of evolution from the start.
Well, and before we move on to talking about evolution as a whole, even granting the origin of life, I do want to talk about some of the ways that evolutionists do try to think that the origin of life might have happened. I've heard people talk about something like even a multiverse theory, like for the origin of life, and we're basically in Marvel movie territory here.
Yes, we are.
But explain why they do that and what it is.
Well, mathematically, you can imagine these things. But practically, we don't have any evidence of any universe other than our own. But what if there are other universes? And, this experiment of life has happened a gazillion times. Well, even the impossible might be probable if you have an infinite number of trials. Okay, that's nice to think of.
In the form of an infinite number of universes.
Yeah, where chemicals floating around some primordial soup on some Earth-like planet, and given the billions of years that Earth is supposed to have been around, probability tells us it's never going to happen. But what if you had 1 trillion years? What if you had 1 trillion times 1 trillion, which is effectively what happens when you have multiple universes? You have all this other time. Okay, great. But sorry, Mr. Evolutionist, we're here now. This is the only one we know about.
Yeah.
This is our reality. The other thing about the multiverse theory is they postulate that the different universes could have different laws of physics.
Okay.
which means that this universe, well, if the laws of physics can vary from universe to universe, how do we know they're the same within this universe? And that's a problem, because they have to assume the laws of physics are always the same everywhere throughout all time across the entire universe, or something different might have happened and they can't use the current laws of physics to explain the universal history. And so they're shooting themselves in the foot there with the multiverse theory. If you want to bring it up, that's just fine. It gets nowhere. It defies reality, and it raises questions that make it even worse for them.
Yeah, and to be clear, we do believe that the laws of physics are uniform, actually, because we believe in a God of order.
Yes, because we believe in a God of order. Now, God can vary them if he wishes. And like at the end, like in Book of Revelation, the heavens are rolled up like a scroll. Clearly, the current laws of physics are not applied at that time.
Yeah.
But as far as we know from all of our experience, we have these laws that God wove into the universe, and they look universal. Okay.
But then all of a sudden, stuff gets weird when you start postulating multiverses to account. And the whole reason that I've heard people do the multiverse theory is because the purely mathematical odds of life arising on our planet by chance are effectively zero.
Effectively zero.
And so I just want to pause for a moment and ask people to consider what's being said here.
Okay.
You have evolutionary biologists saying, well, we can't explain the origin of life. So what we're going to do is we're going to postulate an infinite number of multiverses for which we have no real evidence whatsoever beyond mathematical reasoning, maybe, if you want to be charitable. And we're going to pin our hopes for the meaning and nature of life on that. And I just have to ask the question then, how is that more rational and reasonable than belief in a God who's revealed himself, a God whose character is reflected in the order of the universe because it is orderly, and who has a consistent testimony about himself that he's revealed to humankind, which has been vindicated again and again and again? I can't help but ask the question, who's delusional here?
Yeah, let's believe in the irrational to avoid the obvious. That's essentially what we're boiling it down to here. And DNA is one of those things that will drive someone to those extremes because it cannot have evolved. It cannot. There's nothing in science anywhere to indicate that DNA is going to come out of a primordial soup and become functional with all these integrated components for life to exist. We just started. That's the first half of the argument.
Yeah, and we're kind of just at the halfway point of this discussion, too.
Yep.
We've just been talking about the problems with origins and how it doesn't work.
Yes.
So, for the sake of argument, let's just say life starts by chance.
Okay.
We have living things now to work with.
Okay.
What's the problem with evolution then?
The problem is that you can't maintain DNA in living systems for millions of years. Just period. That's the argument.
Okay, why not?
Because of chemistry. Because DNA keeps on breaking down. So yeah, we have these exquisite DNA repair enzymes and systems, but they're not perfect. And mistakes slip through. Those are called mutations. And mutations almost always are bad. Occasionally there's a mutation that might be beneficial in a limited environment. Like in Central Africa, in the presence of the malaria parasite, it's better to be a carrier of sickle cell anemia and be sick than to be dead.
Okay, and sickle cell anemia, what does that do?
It causes the hemoglobin, the red blood cells, to form crystals. And that tears apart the malaria parasites that live inside the red blood cells.
So you have basically a resistance to malaria now, but it's a mutation.
It's a mutation, and it's not good. Without the malaria parasite, you are at a significant disadvantage if you have sickle cell anemia. Even carriers aren't as healthy as people who don't carry it. So you don't want it. But in the context of, hey, I'm going to be dead from malaria before I'm 10 years old, or I can be a carrier or a full-blown sickle cell anemia, that's a good thing in that context. But that's nothing to do with evolution.
Okay.
Because it's a downward change. Most mutations are negative. A lot of them are almost neutral, but then you're looking for ones that actually have an effect on the organism, and when we find them, almost all of them are bad. So how does evolution work in that case? If everything's going downhill, oh, the very rare beneficial mutation can overwhelm all the negative ones. Not according to math.
And here's the thing too: is people always say that they want to just look at the evidence and see what it's showing. They want to set preconceptions aside. Okay, the evidence is showing that genes are falling apart. Is what it sounds like you're saying.
Yeah. When we look at like humans across the planet, we can look at the letters that we carry, and there's about 10 million variable positions in our genome that are shared amongst all people across the planet. That's showing us we came from a single population, like Adam and Eve, very clearly. But when you look at what's missing, there's deleted genes. Because we have 2 copies of each chromosome, if one part's deleted, usually everything is fine because you have a good copy left over. So deletions happen a lot. The deletions that we see there are millions of them, but they're different than the different populations, meaning that we're falling apart since we were a single population. Our DNA is being deleted. It's literally getting erased over time. Well, if that's true, then how can evolution be true? Because you trace back millions and millions of years, and you have so many holes in your genome that there'd be no way for an individual to find a spouse or a mate that has the complementary missing parts. Mm-hmm. As they build up and build up and build up and build up, extinction is guaranteed. And we see that in the human genome.
And it's happening right now. We're observing it, and there's not really an explanation then for how this fits in with evolution.
Yeah. So deletions show us we fall apart too fast. Generalized mutations, there are a lot of very rare mutations in the human population. Like they're only in you, they're only in your family, only in your tribe, only in your country, and the more spread out they are, the earlier they happen in human history. But they're building up and building up and building up and building up, and it's inexorable. We can't stop it. That shows us that evolution is not possible. Species cannot have been around for millions of years if bad mutations are constantly building up. No, you have to have natural selection has to be able to remove the mutations as fast as they build up, or species go, ew, and they die.
And that's happening too with things like, I think we've talked about this before, like the cheetah.
Yeah. Cheetah is a special case because there aren't many of them.
Mm-hmm.
But because there aren't many of them, there's lots of inbreeding. In the individual between Africa and India where cheetahs exist, they're broken up to little pockets. So now it might be 10,000 of them in the wild, but each little pocket is its own little inbreeding population. So they're split up into isolated pockets and they're falling apart. In other words, each little pocket is a tiny little population with lots of inbreeding. And so the mutation rates are going up, litter size is going down, reproductive incompatibility between mates is plummeting. Cheetahs in the wild are probably going to go extinct because there aren't enough of them. It's a massive problem that happens on a short term. Now, larger populations, it takes longer for that to happen, but it still happens.
Mm-hmm.
If mutations are building up over time, then all populations are doomed to extinction, including humans. Therefore, evolution isn't true. The human race has not been around for millions of years, or we would already be extinct.
Yeah, and the problem gets worse though, because I've heard you talk about, I think we've actually talked about a little bit, the out of Africa model.
Yes.
And how that puts forward that there was a very small population of humans for a very long time.
Yes, a massive problem. So the model goes like this. We had Homo erectuses on the earth, about 1 million of them spread out on the earth. And then a small population in Africa, or the African population shrunk, either way, of about an effective size of about 10,000 individuals. And during what's called a bottleneck, during a very long time, and I'm never told how long that is, but it's 100,000 years or so, that much inbreeding of that little teeny population allowed Homo sapiens to evolve from Homo erectus.
Mm-hmm.
But that little 100,000 or 10,000 population is going to be broken up into little tribes, just like the cheetahs.
Yeah.
How did we evolve? I mean, now we can fly to the moon, and back then we were banging rocks.
Yeah.
How did we become a superior species, intellect and ability and all these other things during a bottleneck that should have driven us to extinction? The number of mutations should have risen to the point where we just all died out. And that's the basic out of Africa model.
And we have that case study in the form of the cheetahs. And
Yes.
that's over, I don't know what the the death rate of cheetahs or the decline of the cheetah population looks like, but that's looking at a bottleneck over a course of maybe call it 100 years.
100 years,
if
maybe
that.
200. Yeah. Yeah. Now do it for 100,000 years, but it's even worse. Because humans have very low diversity across the planet, that's one reason why they had to invoke a bottleneck. Because when you have a small population, you lose a lot of genetic diversity. And we don't have a lot of genetic diversity, but they've postulated recently, some big name evolutionists, an earlier bottleneck about 1 million years ago, where we got down to 1,200 adults for 100,000 years. That's called extinction.
Yeah.
You can't have, that's one, actually, total aside, that's one of my arguments against Bigfoot.
Okay. I would love to hear about that later.
You can't, well, right now, you can't have a slow-growing, slowly reproducing vertebrate species with only a dozen individuals for hundreds of years. No, there's no Bigfoot. You need 10,000 of them at least, and therefore we would find them. You're not going to have an elusive little, hiding over here, one or two individuals. You can't maintain that. You can't maintain it in cheetahs, and you could not have maintained it in humans during this hyper bottleneck 1 million years ago, let alone the out of Africa bottleneck 300, 400, 500,000 years ago.
Okay. So I do want to point people to what biologists are saying, though.
Okay.
They're saying that a relatively short time ago, there weren't that many people on the planet, and we see very rapid expansion and diversification.
Yes.
Well, maybe not diversification relative to other organisms.
Yeah,
but,
just a little bit.
yeah,
little
but
bit.
basically a rapid population expansion from a very small point. And I know in your mind, that's pointing directly to something else.
That is exactly something that the Bible predicts. We started with a small population, Adam and Eve. Now, it's not just Adam and Eve's genomes, because God could have engineered different genomes into Adam and Eve's reproductive cells. So the amount of diversity in humanity might depend upon how many children Adam and Eve had. But then we had 1,1600 years later, a bottleneck at Noah's flood, where the whole earth got down to 8 people on board the ark, but Noah and his wife really don't count. It's like all people today trace back to Shem, Ham, Japheth, and their 3 wives. So the amount of genetic diversity in those 6 people dictates how much genetic diversity we have in the world today. So yeah, not much. And the evolutionists say, not much. Oh, that's really funny. That's exactly what we would predict. And a rapid expansion from there. Yeah, that's exactly. When you look at the Bible and you look at the children of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, they had 16 named sons from those 3 fathers, which you expect about 16 daughters also. Now, they're all spread out in time, but if you went from 6 people to 32 people, that's a really rapid growth rate.
Yeah.
And so the human population would just go, whoosh. Now we have 8 billion people today. That's trivial. From 6 people to 8 billion in 4,500 years is easy. We actually have to slow down the population growth rate. So the evolutionary story is modeling the biblical story. And it's not only that, the evolutionists claim that there's only one male ancestor of all people alive today.
I've heard this, yeah.
Yeah, Y chromosome Adam. And one female ancestor of all people alive today, mitochondrial Eve. That's a direct biblical prediction. That's not necessary in evolutionary theory. They don't need that.
Not at all.
Not at all. Because if we split from population with chimpanzees, you'd expect a diversity of Y chromosomes and diversity of mitochondria. Then over time, that diversity should continue. But no, there's only one. So in their model, they have to invoke this bottleneck to explain how this diversity of Y chromosomes got reduced to 1. And the diversity of mitochondria got reduced to 1. But that's the biblical starting point.
Yeah.
So in many ways, what the evolutionists are discovering about DNA models the biblical predictions in the biblical story. Wrap that up with, you can't start DNA in the origin life scenario, and you can't maintain it in a long-term evolutionary scenario. And the biblical story is shining brightly here.
Yeah. Well, another piece of evidence that people put forward that humans did evolve is they say humans and chimpanzees have very similar genomes from what we're seeing.
Yeah.
And that indicates we likely have a common ancestor. So how do you even begin to approach that topic?
My answer is it doesn't matter.
Okay.
Both sides are predicting similarity. Humans and chimpanzees look similar, so they should have similar genes for building their bodies. Okay. They eat the same foods. They, in many ways, act similarly. We have the same hormones even. So just based on that, what would you expect humans, from a creation perspective, what would you expect humans to be more similar to? A chimpanzee or an aardvark?
A chimpanzee.
A chimpanzee, duh. Yeah, so both sides are predicting similarity, but neither side could predict how much similarity they expected. Nobody knew until they sequenced the genomes.
Mm-hmm. And that just finally actually happened like a year ago maybe or so?
Yeah, a year and a half ago, we finally got a end-to-end, a telomere-to-telomere chimpanzee genome. But that was only 6 months after we finished the human genome. Remember, the human genome was finished in like 2001?
Yeah, I remember
No, it was finished in
that.
2024. It was more than 20 years later when we actually finished it. And now it's finished. We have a good human genome and a good chimpanzee genome. And when you compare them, yes, you can find areas, long stretches of DNA, they're like 98% similar. Great. But then there are areas with zero similarity. How do you calculate a percent similarity when you have a zero? There's a million letters chimpanzees don't have, humans have. What percent similarity is that? So it's actually a very difficult nut to crack. Yeah, when you compare the things that we have in common, high similarity. But when you roll in the things we don't have in common, that similarity is going to drop. And a letter for letter basis, 90% similar or less. On a comparison to comparison basis, 98%, 96% maybe. Fine. But again, no one knew what percentage was beforehand. No one could predict it. And both sides are predicting similarity. So it's a non-argument. It doesn't matter either way.
Because both sides are expecting to find what we found?
Because both sides are expecting to find basically what we found. High similarity.
Yeah.
So does it support common ancestry? Yeah. Does it contradict creation? No. Does it support creation? Sure. But either side, if it was only 90% similar, you know what the evolutionists would have said? Oh, we must have split 20 million years ago, not 6 million years ago. So they just would have backed the clock up based on the data. It's not a predictive engine. It's an ad hoc explanation that they said, aha, look at that. This proves evolution. No, it doesn't. It fits evolution. It doesn't disprove creation. It fits creation, doesn't disprove evolution.
And this is something that I do want to point out here. This maybe is a conversation for a different interview, but it's an illustration of how your assumptions color the way you piece the evidence together.
Yeah, absolutely.
You have a narrative. This is the way humans operate. We have a narrative and then we fit things into the narrative, but the evidence doesn't speak for itself. That's huge.
Yeah.
If you're enjoying this interview so far, you might be interested to know that we also produce the world's most widely read magazine on the creation-evolution controversy, Creation Magazine. It's packed with beautifully illustrated articles showing how real science supports the Bible. It's designed for the whole family and is a great tool to strengthen your faith. Sign up now to receive 4 issues a year. Link in the description. So we talked a lot about, especially in the first half of this video, we were getting into the origins of life, the complexity of it, and then later we talked about how evolution doesn't work. But I do want to talk about some of the objections to intelligent design.
Okay.
Because these are things that I've heard and I've kind of wondered about the answers about.
Okay.
And there's a few different objections. One of them is where people will say, okay, the intelligent design argument falls apart because it fails to account for the idea that you can have very complex structures that then become simpler over time.
Oh, the scaffolding argument.
Yeah, and therefore irreducible complexity is a dumb idea and you should stop using it.
Yeah, but to do that, so essentially it's this, as if you had a very complex system and you have a function in there, well, you can remove the parts that have nothing to do with the function and you still have that subsystem with a good function in there. But let's say this happens in bacteria. They'd have to postulate a hyper-complex bacterial cell that does tons and tons and tons and tons of things. And then these things get deleted because this is all you need. Well, where does the tons of things come from?
Yeah, you're making the argument worse.
Yeah, you're starting the wrong way. You're starting with a hyper-complex cell and then paring it down to a functional something. That's not what they believe. They believe to start as simple. And sure, you might get co-option. I mean, there's examples of things in the cell that look like they used to be doing one thing and now they're doing something simpler. There might be a poison excretion system in a bacteria or something like that. Fine, that can happen, but that's not a good explanation for evolution in general.
It's a far cry to go from, hey, this organelle, I think it's called, or this protein is doing something different, slightly different in this cell, to fine. Now it's completely changing it's becoming a multicellular organism from a single-celled organism.
Yeah,
right?
if the scaffolding idea and reduction of complexity is the driver of evolution, then all of a sudden they have no evolution because they have to start crazy and then get simpler. That's not in their model. So it's not something, you can't generalize that statement. You might be able to find an example or two, but you can't generalize the statement to make it your model of evolution.
Okay. Well, there is another objection too. It's kind of similar. The argument for irreducible complexity is if you don't have all the parts in place, it doesn't work.
Yes.
And I feel like we actually kind of refuted this by just showing how complicated DNA production and repair systems are. But let's go with it. But they'll say a half functional system, like a half functional eye or a half functional, say, bacterial flagellum, can still provide some use for the organism and therefore give an advantage and help it move forward and evolve into something bigger.
Darwin started with, let's consider the eye. Mm-hmm. Let's start with a light-sensitive spot. And then he has this light-sensitive spot, a bend around to make a cup, and then eventually a lens. Now, ignoring the fact that there's some steps in there that would actually have worse vision than the step before.
Okay.
He started with a miracle. The light-sensitive spot. The detection of photons by biomolecules is insane. Photons are strong enough to destroy the pigments that are detecting the light. So how do you have a system, even in your eyeball, every single photon that you detect destroys the pigment molecule. It has to be exported from the cell, fixed, and re-imported.
Wait.
For every single photon that you see, millions upon millions of them per second.
I'm legitimately shocked right now. I didn't know this.
So, let's just start with the light-sensitive spot.
Yeah.
The chemistry of photodetection is nuts. It is super improbable. It's not anything that's going to happen. And not only that, you also need a way to plug in the light detection to a brain so you can make a decision. So you need a chemical system that's incredibly improbable and wiring to a decision-making apparatus. That's what Darwin started with. Everything else after that's trivial.
Yeah.
So just like the DNA and vision, you can have a slightly functional or less functional system, like a light spot in a planaria. They don't have the ability to see like we can see, but they can detect light and dark. Yeah, it's great for the little planaria. Fine. But we've already started with the utterly impossibly complex system. Just like DNA.
Yeah.
But in DNA, you can't have a partially working system.
Even a slightly damaged system is fatal.
If you remove any one of those DNA repair systems, you're going to die. Just like in the famous long-term evolutionary experiment by Richard Lenski. He ran this lab and they took E. coli in 12 bottles with very low nutrients, and they grew them for 25 years. Every day they go into reculture. Half of those bottles went into hypermutation. Half of them. And when you look at the mutations that were being picked up in those bottles, there's different types of mutations because the ones that went into hypermutation had a broken DNA repair system. And different DNA repair systems broke into different cultures and caused them to go into hypermutation. So you cannot have evolution. In other words, you can't maintain life, let's say, because if you can't maintain life, you can't get evolution. You can't maintain life without those DNA repair systems already being in place, fully functional. Now, after they're functional, you can tweak them a little bit. Maybe you want a little more C mutations, maybe a little more A mutations, fine. But you need the system there, functional, or it can't work. So scaffolding doesn't argue well here, and partial functions don't argue well here. There are some things you can have a partial function, like a long cilia or short cilia, a big pore or a little pore. a big pore you might let in a lot of food, and a little pore you might let in less food.
And we're talking about on a bacteria.
Bacteria, but a little pore you need less proteins to make the pore, so therefore it's easier to make. Fine, but without the pore you're dead. You need the pore, you need the proteins, you need the DNA, you need the system that manufactures, pokes a hole in the cell wall, et cetera, or you can't live at all. Once you have life, it can be modified a little bit before it collapses. That's because God designed life to modify. He engineered into living things the ability to adapt and to change over time. This is the ultimate in intelligent design. Evolution doesn't have that ability. You got to start off simple and then add these things, but you can't add the things. That's what we're saying.
Okay, my mind is reeling right now from some of this. I did not know a lot of it, and I'm going to need to take some time to process it. But I know, Rob, you talk a lot about DNA, genetics, and the history of humanity in Ancient DNA, which we are going to be offering for a free stream.
Awesome.
Tell us about what this is about, though, because it's a little bit different focus than what we've been talking about.
But it does talk about DNA decay and breakdown on purpose. For a long time, we only had DNA from living organisms. And then over the last 10 or 15 years, we realized that DNA exists in very old things. Not all of them, but in some things. In fact, when we figured out that the petrous bone, where inner ear bones are, has up to 100 times more DNA in a bone than other bones, that opened up the world of sequencing DNA from ancient people. And so this is amazing because, the secularists talk about the Dark Ages, which is not true. There was no Dark Ages.
Sure.
But there was a Dark Age of history after Noah's flood. Because in most places, maybe 1,000 years or so after the flood, as people are spreading out, they weren't writing things down. So all we have is pots and campfires and spear points and bones. But now we can pull DNA out of the bones. We can tell the story of those people. And it is a very biblical story. Very biblical.
Yeah.
We did not know that 10 years ago. So we're filling in the gaps of human migrations from Babel using ancient DNA. I love this story, and I think it's a great thing. I think Christians and creationists should grab onto it because, well, first of all, DNA breaks down so quickly, going back to the beginning. There should not be any DNA in very old bones at all. The fact that DNA is there tells us they're not as old as the evolutionist claims. And then the story that we read in the DNA as it's spreading out is a very biblical Tower of Babel sort of story. So it's very exciting, and I highly recommend that.
And the link to that free stream will be in the description. Dr. Carter, thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. This is my pleasure.